Tom jerked awake to the overwhelming silence. Something was wrong. The rhythmic hum of his farm's irrigation system, usually his morning soundtrack, was gone. No buzzing, no clicking, just an eerie, unnatural quiet. His stomach tightened. Rushing to the window, he expected to see the usual mist of sprinklers coating his crops in the soft, golden light of dawn. Instead, he saw dry soil, motionless pipes, and his cattle pacing restlessly by the barn. Fear shot through him as he bolted outside, his boots kicking up dust on the way to the breaker box. His fingers stumbled with the metal latch, yanking it open. The switches were undamaged, no signs of tripped circuits. Then he spotted it, his power lines slashed and dangling like limp vines from the poles, their raw edges exposed to the morning breeze. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this intentionally, and he already had a good idea who. His suspicions were proven when he stomped back toward the main road and spotted Karen Monroe standing on her porch, coffee in hand, wearing a smug little grin. Her oversized sunglasses barely hid the self-satisfied tilt of her face. "Morning, neighbor," she chirped, lifting her cup in a mock toast. Tom's jaw tightened so hard it ached. "Did you do this?" he demanded, voice razor-sharp. Karen widened her eyes in exaggerated innocence. "Do what?" He pointed to the damaged power lines. "My farm runs on that power, my irrigation, my storage freezers, my entire livelihood depends on it. And someone," he gestured at the severed cables, "decided to take a pair of cutters and shut me down." Karen sipped her coffee casually, clearly enjoying his frustration. "Oh dear, that sounds awful. But honestly, Tom, those lines were such an eyesore, I did everyone a favor." His hands balled into fists. "A favor?" She tilted her head, pretending sympathy. "You know, it's a real shame about your little farm, but maybe you should have considered looks before ruining the view for everyone else." Tom could barely think straight over the roaring in his ears. He wasn't a violent man, but at that moment, he had to physically stop himself from knocking that smirk right off her arrogant face. Instead, he turned on his heel and marched back toward his property, phone already in hand. He needed the power company. He needed legal action. He needed Karen to pay for this. It didn't take long for the effects to start building up. By midday, the sun shone down harshly, and his crops, already weak from the recent heat wave, began wilting. His dairy products and storage were at risk of ruining, and his animals, used to a constant water supply, started to show signs of distress. Every passing hour without electricity meant money losses, stacking up like a bad poker hand. The power company arrived in the afternoon, their truck kicking up a cloud of dust as it rolled in. The technician took one look at the damaged lines and let out a low whistle. "Wow, someone really had it out for you," he murmured, adjusting his helmet. "This ain't just destruction. This is intentional sabotage." Tom folded his arms, his jaw a rigid line. "How soon can you repair it?" The man rubbed his beard. "Normally a week, maybe 2, but if you want an urgent fix, that'll run you about 15 grand, special crew, fast-track job. You know the process." Tom's chest sank. $15,000. He'd already planned tightly for the season, and dropping that kind of cash overnight was an option. He glanced back at Karen's house. She had done this. She had to be held accountable. He wasn't about to let her escape with this, not this time. Later that evening, after making a few calls, Tom sat at his dining table reviewing his security footage. He'd set up cameras around the farm after Karen had earlier trespassed to complain about sound pollution from his machine. Sure enough, at around 3 in the morning, the footage revealed a figure creeping along the fence line, bolt clippers in hand. The grainy night mode made details hard to see, but the stance, the outline, it was undoubtedly Karen. His blood heated. He rewound the clip, watching again as she took her time adjusting herself before slicing through the lines. She didn't hurry, didn't pause. This was planned. The next morning, Tom marched straight into the police office, the footage saved onto a drive. Sheriff Dawson, a stocky man with a strict demeanor, leaned back in his seat as he watched the recording. When it ended, he let out a long exhale and glanced at Tom. "Well, I'll be shocked," Dawson mumbled. "That's some strong evidence you got there. So what happens now?" Tom asked, arms folded. Dawson groaned, rubbing the top of his nose. Messing with power lines, that's a crime. Disrupting public utilities is serious business. She could be looking at a penalty, maybe even prison time, depending on the court. Tom didn't react. Good. The sheriff observed him for a moment. You sure you want to go through with this? Lawsuits can get complicated. Tom's look didn't shift. She took thousands. She knew precisely what she was doing, and she stood on her porch and grinned about it. Dawson let out a low laugh. All right then, let's make her regret it. By the evening, an official notice was delivered to Karen's home, notifying her of the legal action against her. Tom watched from a distance as she unfolded the paper, her expression shifting from amusement to irritation to outright panic. She whirled around, spotting Tom standing by his truck. "Are you serious?" she shrieked, marching toward him, flailing the document like a battle flag. Tom didn't even blink. "Dead serious. You can't do this. I was just committing a felony," he cut in smoothly. "Yeah, that's exactly what you did." Her face turned a blotchy shade of red. "Oh, come on, Tom, this is ridiculous. It's just some wires. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Try telling that to the judge," he said, nodding toward the sheriff's car parked by the road. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time since she'd moved in, she wasn't smirking. She wasn't condescending. She was panicked, and Tom savored every second of it. By the time she stormed back inside, slamming her door hard enough to rattle the windows, Tom knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. He wasn't just going to win, he was going to make sure she paid for every single thing she had done. And if she thought she could weasel her way out of this, she had another thing coming. Tom spent the next morning pacing across his farmhouse porch, his mind running through every possible angle. Karen had crossed the line, literally and legally. She had trespassed, sabotaged his farm, and then had the audacity to act as if she had done nothing wrong. But this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. She needed to understand that actions had consequences, and Tom was determined to make sure she felt every last one of them. He drove into town, his truck kicking up dust as he pulled into his lawyer's office. Steve Holloway had been handling legal matters for farmers in the area for years, and if anyone knew how to handle something like this, it was him. As Tom laid out every detail, Karen's previous complaints, her growing hostility, the security footage of her cutting the power lines, Steve's expression remained unreadable. When Tom was done, the lawyer leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. "Well," Steve finally said, "she's in deep trouble. You've got trespassing, destruction of property, and the big one, interference with public utilities. That last one alone could land her with a massive fine. Could even turn criminal, depending on how the judge sees it." Tom crossed his arms. "How massive?" Steve cracked his knuckles and reached for a stack of forms. "We hit her where it hurts. I'll file the lawsuit today, but I suggest you get statements from the power company and anyone else who can confirm the damage was intentional. The stronger your case, the harder it will be for her to wiggle out of this." Tom left the office with a renewed sense of purpose. If Karen thought she could play innocent, she was about to get a rude awakening. By the time he reached his farm, he was already on the phone with the power company, requesting an official report on the damage and the cost of repairs. The man on the other end of the line didn't hesitate. "Oh, we've already written that up. This isn't the first time we've dealt with someone pulling a stunt like this," the technician said. "You're looking at about 15 grand in repair costs. And because it was deliberate, she's going to be on the hook for all of it." Tom smiled to himself. That was exactly what he needed. Later that day, as he made his usual stop at the local feed store, he overheard something that made his blood boil. Karen, oblivious as ever, was holding court in the middle of the store, laughing loudly as she regaled a few other customers with a heavily exaggerated version of her heroic actions. "I mean, come on, was I supposed to just sit there and let my property value drop because of some ugly wires?" she said, shaking her head. "He should be thanking me. I made his land look better. Besides, what kind of farmer relies on electricity that much anyway? Doesn't he know how to work the land the old-fashioned way?" Tom clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. It was almost amusing how confident she was, completely unaware of what was coming. her way. He pulled out his phone and discreetly recorded her little speech. When she threw in a few more gems about how she had single-handedly improved the neighborhood and how Tom was just overreacting like a big baby, he knew he had exactly what he needed. He sent the recording to Steve that night. The lawyer responded almost immediately with a simple message. "This is gold." The next morning, Tom woke up to the sight of a county inspector's truck pulling up his driveway. The man stepped out, clipboard in hand, and introduced himself as Mitch Sanders. "Got a call from the sheriff's office about some possible property violations," he said, flipping through his notes. "Says here you mentioned Karen's fence might be encroaching on your land." Tom nodded. "Yeah, when I first bought this place, I had the boundary markers checked. That fence of hers wasn't there back then. She put it up a few months ago, and I'm pretty sure she didn't bother checking the actual property line." Mitch adjusted his hat and gestured for Tom to walk with him. They strolled over to the fence line, where the inspector pulled out a set of boundary maps and measured the placement. After a few minutes of double-checking, he let out a low whistle. Well, looks like she's about 3 feet over your property line." Tom raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" Mitch grinned. "Means she's technically trespassing every time she steps on this side of the fence, and if she built anything on this land, that's another legal issue for her to deal with." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. This just kept getting better. By the afternoon, the first official legal notice had been delivered to Karen's house. Tom didn't have to see her read it to know. She was fuming. He could practically feel the rage radiating from her property. Sure enough, barely an hour later, she stormed across the yard, waving the papers wildly in the air. "This is insane," she shrieked, her voice carrying through the open space. "You're actually suing me over some stupid power lines?" Tom leaned against his truck, arms crossed. "Not just the power lines, Karen. The property encroachment, the damages, the trespassing. You really did a number on yourself." Karen huffed, throwing her hands up. "This is harassment. I'll take this to court, and you'll regret it." Tom smirked. "That's exactly where we're going, Karen. See you there." She stomped off, slamming her front door so hard that one of the porch decorations fell over. Tom shook his head, already looking forward to the day when she'd realize just how badly she had miscalculated. A week later, the court summons arrived. Karen's attempts to delay the case had failed, and she was officially on the hook for damages. But she wasn't done fighting yet. Word spread around town that she had hired a lawyer, some big-shot real estate attorney who probably had no experience in criminal or property damage cases. It was a last-ditch effort, and Tom knew it. The night before the hearing, Tom sat at his kitchen table, reviewing everything one last time: the surveillance footage, the recorded confession at the feed store, the power company's report, the property violation notice, every single piece of evidence stacked against Karen. When he finally went to bed, he slept soundly for the first time in days. Tomorrow, the real fun would begin. The courtroom was packed. Small-town cases rarely drew this kind of crowd, but the whole town had heard about what Karen had done, and they wanted to see how it all played out. Tom sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer, Steve, flipping through a folder of meticulously organized evidence. Across the room, Karen was seated beside her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an overpriced suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She, on the other hand, had that same smug look on her face, as if she still believed she could talk her way out of this. The judge, an older man with years of no-nonsense experience, entered the room, and everyone stood. Once the proceedings began, Karen's lawyer tried to dismiss the case as a neighborly dispute, blown out of proportion. He painted Tom as an overreacting farmer who wanted to punish a woman for simply wanting a better view. Tom remained silent, waiting for his turn. He had no doubt the facts would speak for themselves. Steve stood up calmly, but firmly, laying out the case. He played the security footage, and the room went quiet. There was Karen, in the dead of night, bolt cutters in hand, deliberately slicing through the power lines. The smirk on her face was unmistakable, even in the grainy footage. Then came the recording from the feed store, Karen bragging about her actions, mocking Tom's farm and loss of income. The look on her face shifted from smug to stunned. Karen jumped up, pointing a finger at Tom. "That's taken out of context," she shrieked. "I was joking." The judge didn't even look at her. He turned to the power company representative, who confirmed the $15,000 repair bill. Then came the county inspector, explaining how Karen's fence encroached on Tom's land by 3 feet. By the time Steve was finished, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Karen's lawyer tried to fight back, but it was useless. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped together, and stared at Karen. He reminded her that tampering with power lines wasn't just a minor infraction. It was a serious legal offense. She had knowingly damaged critical infrastructure, trespassed on private property, and showed no remorse. His ruling was swift and brutal. She was fined $50,000, ordered to cover all repair costs, and forced to remove her illegal fence immediately. Karen's jaw dropped. $50,000? You can't be serious, she wailed. I don't have that kind of money. The judge gave her a cold, unimpressed look. Then I suggest you find a way to pay. With that, he slammed the gavel. It was over. Tom walked out of the courthouse with his head held high. Justice had been served, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Karen, on the other hand, was fuming, ranting to anyone who would listen about how unfair the whole thing was. No one seemed to care. The town had seen her for what she was, and there was no sympathy left for her. Within a week, Karen put her house up for sale. She had no choice. The fine, combined with the lawsuit and legal fees, had drained her finances. Rumors spread that she tried to negotiate her way out of the payments, but no one was willing to help her. She had burned too many bridges. Tom didn't see much of her after that, but he did get a good laugh when he heard that the person who bought her house was an engineer from the power company. Ironically, the new owner planned to set up even more power lines, improving the structure for the entire region. Karen had struggled so much to remove them, and now they were returning stronger than ever. With the compensation money, Tom made upgrades to his farm. He fitted solar panels, making sure he would never be at the control of the power grid again. He strengthened his fencing, installed security cameras, and even grew his business. What began as a crisis had become an advantage, and he wasn't going to miss it. The final time Tom saw Karen was the day she moved out of town. He happened to be passing by when she was packing the last of her belongings into a transport truck. She met his gaze, and for a quick moment, she looked like she wanted to say something, an insult, a farewell remark, maybe even an apology. But then she just sighed, turned aside, and stepped into the truck. As she drove away, Tom couldn't help but grin. He had succeeded, and no matter where Karen ended up next, he had a thought she wouldn't forget this lesson anytime soon.